The 1970s saw a wave of sci-fi horror films that connected second-wave feminism with the increasing advances in technology at the time. They explored themes of autonomy and liberation, particularly among middle-class white women in America.
In the town of Stepford, the men are getting exactly what they always dreamed of: perfect wives.
In 1975, Brian Forbes adapted Ira Levin's hit novel The Stepford Wives, depicting a world in which sexually liberated women were being killed and replaced by subservient sex bots.
She's changed, and stop telling me I'm crazy!
A couple of years later, Donald Cammell's Demon Seed depicted the kind of physically and sexually abusive domestic relationship we had never seen before, one in which Julie Christie is forced into being a subservient wife and mother by a machine.
Open the door, Alfred. Can you hear me? Open the door.
All electrical and mechanical systems here are now under my control.
Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of man-made monsters, and we discuss Brian Forbes' The Stepford Wives and Donald Cammell's Demon Seed. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Muncer, and as ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the midst of our 11th season, exploring the evolution of man-made monsters, and this is part 15. In this week's episode, as that intro suggested, we're going to be looking at two female-centric sci-fi horror films from the 1970s, The Stepford Wives and Demon Seed. Both of these films are dark and fun, and I would recommend you watch both of them before listening to our discussion. So joining me to discuss these two bangers, I've got a returning guest. She is one of the busiest and most respected figures in horror journalism. She was here last year to discuss The Birds with me, and she's back. Queen of horror herself, Alexandra Heller-Nicholas. Hello, Alex.
Hello. So good to be back in the saddle, in the horrific saddle.
How are you doing? We on my Patreon, Alex, we review a lot of new physical media releases every month. You know, all these beautiful boutique releases, and we're always mentioning that you feature on so many of them. I just feel like you must be one of the busiest women in horror. How are you? Are you still finding time to also relax in amongst all the millions of things you do?
I love that we've been talking for like 90 seconds and it's instantly turned into therapy.
I know. I was like, I'm gonna check how she's doing. Yeah.
I love you. I love you so much. I'm fine, thank you. Weirdly enough, I think you know, unironically, I think doing that kind of work is therapy. There's nothing I love more than doing what you do, right? Which is like immersing yourself in like one film and just spending a couple of hours like deep in thought about it. It's an unusual job, but it's a job I'm extremely grateful for.
I love that. That's very cool. So, and how are you generally, other than that? How's your 2025 been so far, Alex?
It's pretty busy. So as we speak, the documentary film, Alexandra Heller-Nicholas' documentary Chain Reactions, which was made to mark the 50th anniversary of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That's in the midst of having its digital streaming physical media rollout. That won the prize at Venice last year for the best documentary on film. And I'm in that. So it's very like one of these kids is not like the other. I'm in that documentary alongside Takashi Miike, Karen Kusama, Patton Oswalt, and some guy called Stephen King, who I think is like a really interesting up and coming talent. I think he's going to do really well.
Shit, that is.
So I'm like the one not famous person.
That's absolutely incredible. Do you know, I love Alexandra Heller-Nicholas documentaries. I haven't caught this one yet, but I absolutely loved what is it, 78, 52, whatever it's called, that one, and Lynch Oz. I'm a big fan.
Lynch Oz is amazing,
and Texas Chainsaw is my favorite horror film of all time. So I'm so excited.
You are in for a treat, and it's streaming now, so you can catch it. And my documentary, I say my documentary, it's directed by Donna Davies, a Canadian filmmaker, but a documentary of my book 1000 Women in Horror has been made by Shudder, and that is now on the festival circuit with a streaming date coming very soon. So we've just played Sydney, Melbourne, Sitges in Spain. We've played New York. We've got an upcoming date in Amsterdam for Imagine Film Festival. So it's all happening.
That is so cool. How was that experience for you, seeing your book turned into a movie? That must have been surreal.
It was very, very strange, but the team were incredible. Just an incredible group of people. Donna Davies is a horror documentary film witch. So she was exactly the right person, and we just had the exact right team on board.
Amazing.
So it's been really exciting.
Oh, love it. Love it. Well, that's so cool. Congratulations. I cannot wait to see all of these exciting movies. That's awesome. So let me ask you a little bit about the theme that we're talking about this series on the podcast. Obviously, last year you joined me to talk about these kind of nature bites back movies, and we talked about the birds. And I guess this year I'm kind of looking at the flip side to that, the kind of man-made monsters. So the dangers of science and kind of what human beings kind of reap on the world, essentially. What are your thoughts generally on this kind of subgenre, I suppose, Alex, the kind of mad scientist subgenre?
I think it's really fascinating. I mean, I really, just as a fan, I really love horror movies that kind of tease out the anxieties and the sort of tensions that we otherwise find hard to talk about in a more direct or frank way. And I think films about mad scientists or science run amok, I think at their heart, they're really about the kind of tensions and the discomfort we have with ideas of progress.
Right.
Just as human animals, we know progress is good, but it also kind of stresses us out at the same time.
Yes.
And brings with it a whole bunch of things that we find difficult to talk about. I mean, I love films like Eyes Without a Face. I love Altered States. I love Body Melt. So even moving beyond the kind of, Frankenstein paradigm, there's so many different ways to approach these kinds of ideas in film, in this sort of, science fiction, horror kind of crossover. But the films that we've chosen to talk about today, things like Stepford Wives and Demon Seed, to me, these are really precious because they really tap into my personal interest, which is that they really emphasize the gender politics that are kind of inherent in the idea of man-made monsters.
Yeah.
The emphasis on the man there.
It's true.
What is the cost? What is the cost? What is at stake? What are the issues when masculine power kind of flexes its research muscle at the stake of feminized subjects? That's what I find really interesting.
It's so true, actually. I haven't really gotten to talk about that yet at this point in the series, but you're so right. I mean, even the phrase man-made monsters, and
right.
that was partly deliberate on my part because it so often is in these movies, right? And I guess again it is that flip side of, I guess, like women being the quote-unquote creators when it comes to nature, right? And then man having a go at trying their luck at being creators in this kind of world of mad science and the consequences of that often.
Exactly. And I mean, it all goes back to Mary Shelley, right?
Yeah, 18-year-old Mary Shelley, who essentially launched this entire subgenre and genre, really.
I mean, I think what that story does, and what this kind of category does in general is it sort of teases out these fears, I guess, about the sort of assumed utopian vision of progress.
Yeah.
Again, these kind of anxieties and these fears that are sort of surround that cliched idea of just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. And Mary Shelley, I think, is so crucial to this because what she did that was so important, not just for horror cinema, not just for science fiction cinema, not just for Gothic literature, was that she really framed these bigger questions around her kind of, deeply fraught personal experiences, these things like motherhood and mortality, ambition, being in this really fraught marriage, these deeply kind of personal things for her that she kind of works through. Frankenstein, there's that old phrase that the personal is the political.
Right.
And Mary Shelley really embodies that. You can't talk about Frankenstein and not talk about pregnancy and the things that Mary was going through in her own life.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely remarkable. Do you trust technology, Alex? How do you feel about, AI and all of the current advances we're seeing in the world right now?
Mate, how much time have you got? It's funny, like watching Demon Seed in particular again, which of course we'll talk about a bit more today. I just couldn't stop thinking, if we're at a point now where we're using AI to just crunch data, do things like cure cancer, cure leukemia, that kind of thing, I think we'd be having a very different conversation now around AI than we are living in a world where it's being used to replace artists, to replace writers, to replace psychologists, to replace friends. I was talking to somebody recently who does communications for a funeral home who's just had their job replaced by AI.
What?
You know, we don't need AI to replace us. You know, we needed to crunch data. We can use it for things that we don't have the capacity to do, but that's not what we're doing. I'm very passionate about this. I've had 8 books stolen by to train Gen AI, and I'm involved in a class action suit. I've published 10 books, so this is like quite literally like my life's work that has been stolen to train AI. So yeah, I'm involved in a class action suit. So I reject AI in a very passionate way because my livelihood is at direct, is being directly impacted by it. I mean, like I said, I've got friends that have lost their jobs to AI. And I do think that, in the hands of the right people, that we could be using it in a really productive, beneficial way. But, we live in this sort of late capitalist dystopian car crash, and it's just in the hands of the wrong people using it the wrong way for the wrong reasons. And it just is so... It's like it runs on I run on a spectrum from depressed to furious when it comes to this stuff.
Absolutely. Completely agree. And isn't it crazy? I mean, we're going to talk about this so much across the next 2 films because I just feel like how prescient were these 2 films that we're about to talk about that idea of this kind of select bunch of privileged dudes who have created this stuff, or and have changed the world in so many ways. Yeah.
Right. These films have a reputation as being these sort of camp classics.
Right.
And that's really how they've sort of, with remakes and things like that, that's really how they've been kind of understood, in the decades following their original release. But I really pack a bong for these films. I'll really go into bat for them. I think that they're perhaps not as camp and not as ridiculous and not as sort of kind of moral panic ridden as perhaps they were imagined at the time. I think that there are elements of these films that are chilling in how prescient they were.
I completely agree. I'm excited to discuss it. Let's get into it. So we'll go chronologically. So we'll begin by talking about The Stepford Wives, the original movie, The Stepford Wives from 1975.
In the town of Stepford, the men are getting exactly what they always dreamed of, perfect wives. And the dream is becoming a nightmare for the Stepford Wives. A very modern suspense story from the author of Rosemary's Baby. The Stepford Wives, about what men can do behind closed doors.
All right, so The Stepford Wives follows Joanna Eberhardt, who's played by Catherine Ross, who moves from New York City with her husband and kids to this sort of white picket fence, ideal suburban town of Stepford. And she is increasingly freaked out by these sort of turbo weird trad wives that make up the community. And she finally makes a normal friend whose name is Bobby, who's played by Paula Prentice. And they sort of decide to start a kind of feminist consciousness raising group together to try to kind of mobilize their community and put it a little bit more back on track with the second wave feminism that was really sweeping the United States at this period. But basically, the few women who seem to be on Joanna and Bobby's wavelength, they're kind of one by one trad-wived themselves, and eventually Bobby herself is, and that leaves Joanna totally isolated and terrified of what is actually happening. She knows the men are doing something, but she doesn't know what. We find out later in the film that before the women of Stepford become these kind of trad wives, the local women themselves were actually fairly mobilized feminists. They'd actually started their own group long before Joanna got there. And at the end of the movie, the big reveal is that Joanna learns that the men in the town who meet under the guise of the local men's association have been basically building copycat robots of these women who killed the women off and replaced them with trad wife robots that look exactly like them. The very famous final shot of this movie, of course, is incredibly depressing and incredibly ironic. It's sort of this bleak Circean image, which is that despite all of her attempts to escape and to survive, Joanna herself is replaced by a robot. And we have this incredible image of her moving in slow motion with all the other trad wife robots of Stepford, moving through a supermarket and speaking to each other in these kind of dead-eyed, soulless kind of conversations. It's really chilling. It's really one of the great famous endings of any kind of horror movie or science fiction movie.
Yeah, completely. I agree with you. And it is a funny thing. You mentioned this. It's a funny mix because you're right. This movie has a reputation as being, I guess, a bit of a campy, satirical, black comedy, I suppose. But actually, there is something truly fucking dark and bleak at the heart of this movie. And it ends on such a bleak note, doesn't it? And I think that takes people by surprise when they first watch it.
Yeah, look, I came to this film very much through, like I was young, watching it on video in the 90s. And it was real like asshole irony stuff, like so bad it's good. And I hate that so much now. Like I really rally against that kind of ironic viewing. But, I was a dickhead. I was young and it's like, oh, it's so bad it's good. And it was sort of 70s and this sort of camp kind of thing. And I know that certainly for me and a lot of people who were watching it and discovering it around the time that I was, we felt that it was sort of completely excessive and completely over the top in its sort of moral panic, I guess, about feminism and the threat of men and science. And now it feels like a documentary.
Right.
It's sort of like, so much of this film is, and Demon Seed as well, but I just find it such a heavy viewing experience. Now, I don't find it camp and I don't find it funny. I find it really, actually, I find this film quite bleak and depressing and again, like really spooky in just how capable it was of really looking into the future. Yeah. And really nailing some of the stuff that's going on quite specifically now, like in really creepy ways.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously this was based on the Ira Levin novel from only a couple of years earlier, 1972. And again, there is something actually, again, when you think of another really famous Ira Levin adaptation, Rosemary's Baby, there's a similar vibe, right? There's a kind of fun, what could be accused of campiness to it, but it's getting there's something really truly bleak and real at the heart of it as well, and a real downer ending too. And there are a lot of parallels there. Ira Levin did some really smart writing and smart stories right at this time.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that I think it would be fair to assume that the film adaptation of Stepford Wives, just from a kind of, economic business sense, probably, it's like, okay, well, Rosemary's Baby went well. Let's do Stepford Wives. There's a kind of corporate logic there.
Sure.
I think that it's not a coincidence that both of these films are sort of often dismissed as these sort of excessive, camp, over the top films because they're about women in crisis. I think that it's actually fascinating that both of these films at their heart are effectively about the same thing. They're really about men who sacrifice their wives for their own selfish vision of what they see as their perfect future.
Right.
That's what both films are about.
Yes.
And one of them goes into, demonic pregnancy and the other one goes into sort of sex bot trad wife robots. Very, very kind of, they use different kind of generic tools to tell these stories, but at their core, they're literally about the same thing.
Yeah.
Men who sacrifice their wives for selfish reasons.
Yeah.
Which is kind of crazy when you think about it, that they are so specifically about the same thing. And I do think that the way that, especially as we move through the 80s, through the backlash to the second wave feminism, moving into the kind of post-feminist, kind of, third wave of the 90s, this idea that these concerns, that these feminist concerns were dismissed and sort of rendered excessive and sort of reduced to something silly or a kind of moral panic. So I do think that the kind of camp reputation that a film like Stepford Wives has in particular does come from this sort of quite ideological rejection of women's concerns about the violence that men will do to them.
Just tell me a little bit more about what you mean then about the moral panic. As in, like, was there a backlash to this movie because they thought this is so ridiculous and over the top, a thing to worry about, essentially?
So I guess the moral panic applies more to the idea of the kind of feminist backlash more generally.
Yeah.
That women, this idea of women are excessive and hysterical, and they're amplifying their fears because they can't be, they're these sort of hysterical, panicked women. And this film sort of became, in a pop cultural sense, it sort of became a kind of emblem or mascot for that idea. And I think that that's why the film became this sort of camp classic.
Right, yeah.
And I think that the irony is that we look back at it now, all these years later, and it's not that ironic. It's not that excessive, and it's not that camp. Aesthetically, I think if you're not familiar with films from the 1970s, it can perhaps look a little kind of camp and strange to you. But I think it would be hard to watch this film now and just purely dismiss it as a kind of excessive, over the top, silly panic.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like actually a lot of the concerns that this film raises about women and autonomy and technology, we see on the news every day. We see people talking about on social media literally every day.
Oh my God. And actually, and we'll talk about this a bit more maybe towards the end, but the legacy that this film has had and the amount of films that you could say, I think, owe a debt to the Stepford Wives, everything. Look at Jordan Peele's Get Out. I think that in some ways is a kind of modern retelling of the Stepford Wives, right? And yeah, that was obviously extremely sort of favourably embraced by the critical community and commercially, so it's really interesting.
Right.
And of course, like you say, I think it is really interesting that feminist groups took issue with this movie at the time, right? People like Betty Friedan and even certain critics like Pauline Kael kind of gave this quite a scathing review at the time as well. So it is really interesting. It's one of those movies that I think its kind of reputation has sort of changed and evolved over time as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is I think that happens. And feminism in the sort of 60s and 70s, the kind of second wave feminism, it's worth pointing out that the idea of intersectionality wasn't a thing. Feminism was a very, very kind of white middle class idea. And the fact that this film almost lampoons that, the fact that this film really says, okay, feminism is about white middle class women.
Yeah.
I think that there's a discomfort there because these weren't conversations that were really being had in the mainstream at the time that this film came out. You had black feminists, you had a lot of lesbian feminists who were sort of saying, actually, can we talk about race? Can we talk about class? Can we talk about sexuality? Right. And they were really drowned out by a lot of these sort of middle class kind of groups that we see in the film. So I think that the film in a way was kind of, it wasn't just it wasn't just attacking men and the things that men were capable of. It was sort of presenting feminism in a way that I think that there was a bit of discomfort around from within the ranks itself.
Interesting. So the film itself, obviously, and again, interestingly, kind of entirely made by dudes as well, right? So you've got Ira Levin, who wrote the novel, then you've got William Goldman, who adapted it and wrote the screenplay, and then you've got Brian Forbes, who's directed it. How do you find this as a piece of cinema, or as a film adaptation, and the way it's been sort of directed and adapted?
I think the way that Goldman really amplifies, and it's quite different from the novel, but he really amplifies the friendship between Bobby and Joanna. The novel is a bit more sci-fi.
Right.
Whereas the film is very much about this relationship and how this relationship really saves, up to a point, that it really saves these two women, that feeling of finding a kindred spirit. I think it's such an authentic portrait of new friendship.
Yeah.
Where you just want to hang out and get drunk and you're kind of giddy. It's not quite like being in love, but that new friend buzz where you just want to, get drunk and hang out.
Yeah.
And this sort of almost this surprise of solidarity. I think it's such a beautiful portrait of new women's friendship.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually the heart of the film, and that makes the tragedy of where it goes just so much more poignant. But Brian Forbes, I think, does an amazing job. I think he's a really underrated filmmaker. He made a film a couple of years before this, a British film from 1964 called Seance on a Wet Afternoon, that is honestly one of my favourite films. I think it's so dark and it's so bleak.
Yeah.
But again, it shares with this film. They're very, very different kinds of movies, but they both fundamentally share this idea that there are kind of double layers to this sort of idealized vision of domesticity. You know, that we have this sort of rosy pretense of everything being perfect, but underneath there are these kind of really shocking, these shocking kind of realities that really bubble away.
Yeah.
This sort of toxicity underneath this sort of pretense of everything being fine. Seance on a Wet Afternoon is just, again, it's a really bleak film.
I love that. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. I'm just having a look at it now. Kib Stanley, Richard Attenborough.
Yeah, it's basically about a woman who is a psychic, and she's desperate for fame, and she basically bullies her husband into kidnapping a child so that she can pretend to help the police solve the crime. It was remade by Kiyoshi Kurosawa, I believe, and I think it's just called Seance. If you've ever seen that film, that's a remake of Seance on a Wet Afternoon. Has a very different ending to the British one.
Wow. Okay.
But amazing. So yeah, Brian Forbes did the original. I think it's one of the great British thrillers. Really, just an incredibly bleak film. But you can absolutely see these interests that Forbes has.
Yes.
In terms of the pretense and the superficial gloss of happiness.
Well, I love
domestic
that.
Harmony.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it is sort of underrated actually, the direction in this movie, and again, just how influential that idea is. I mean, we talk about David Lynch's Blue Velvet and so many movies beyond that are with that same kind of tone, right? That kind of glossy suburbia with the darkness lying beneath the surface, right? And I think Brian Forbes really kind of, he does such an amazing job of that, because I think there is this really interesting weird tonal thing going on in this film where it is kind of light and happy and clappy, but you also feel that something is off, right? Something is uncanny, something is not right from the very beginning, and it's very subtly done until the end. I
think for me, it's I think that there is something Circean about this film. I think there is a Circean irony in that there's this tension between film style, which is this sort of beautiful, glossy, idealized vision of suburban life. And there's a tension between that and the reality of what's actually happening here. And you're right. I think that David Lynch taps into exactly that. I think that this is a really important film if we want to look at the prehistory of David Lynch's work. But also, I think somebody like Stephen King, this sort of the dark underbelly of this sort of rosy, sort of happy suburban life. There's so many of these really key figures who are really tapping into that. And again, the fact that this film is sort of dismissed as sort of camp, I think kind of undermines its ideological heart in a really kind of deliberate way.
Well, exactly. It knows what it's doing, right? I think those moments when it can appear camp is very, very deliberate. It is showing this kind of ludicrous, absurd world almost, isn't it? I think
exactly. And I think to be able to dismiss this film as camp, you need to be very comfortable with the idea that the fears that it's exploring are excessive and hysterical, which themselves are gendered ideas, right? It's like women are so over the top and they're so hysterical and they're so excessive,
right?
And like we keep saying, it's like actually this film was kind of tapping into some stuff that's pretty contemporary from where we are now. Like it's, the whole idea of, of the trad wife.
Yeah.
The trad wives and Stepford wives are the same thing. That being a trad wife is something that people now unironically say that they are.
Yeah.
Is genuinely terrifying to me. It's like saying I'm a Stepford wife. Like it's just it's genuinely chilling. Like I find it so, I mean, we couldn't have imagined, even in 2004 when the remake came out, that we would ever reach a point of being post-ironic about the Stepford wives.
Yeah, you're absolutely
that this is being a Stepford wife is something that people would unironically aspire to being is mind-blowing to me.
Well, yeah, I even in the last 5 years, I would say this has become more prescient than ever, right? And I guess it's the same kind of thing. There's a backlash to progression, right? In the same way that this was depicting a backlash to second wave feminism of the 60s, what we have actually been seeing in the real world over the last 5 years is a backlash to kind of progressive, what people would call woke, right? There's now a backlash against woke, and rights are being taken away, right, from women, from trans people, from minorities. it's literally happening,
Right.
you know. And I think, that you're absolutely right. The Stepford Wives kind of no longer appears kind of campy and ironic for that reason. It's we see it around the world.
And where it leads up to, and I think this is so intrinsically linked to Catherine Ross's performance in this film, when Bobby is converted and she's heartbroken. Joanna's just heartbroken because she's lost her friend. And the fear, she ends up going to a psychologist or a counselor. And the fear that she expresses is just so poignant and it feels so contemporary. It's like, I know the men are doing something. I know they want to hurt me. I know that they're hurting women, but I don't know how. And I don't know how to protect myself because I don't know what the threat is. And I don't know what the threat is to my children.
Right.
I don't know how you can watch those sequences of Catherine Ross really freaking out. I don't know how you can watch them today and dismiss them as kind of camp or ironic. I think that there's something so incredibly kind of moving about the lack of specificity of the threat.
Yeah.
In that there's almost there's this ambient threat out there and I don't know what it is, but I know that it's real and I can't articulate it. But I in my core, deep down, I feel extremely vulnerable and extremely at risk and something's really wrong.
Right.
And she just keeps saying this over and over again. There's something really wrong in Stepford and I don't know what it is.
Oh, God.
It's devastating.
It is devastating. It is. What do you think of Catherine Ross's performance then as this character of Joanna?
I think she's amazing. I think she's actually one of the great unheralded actors from this era. I first saw her in this amazing Curtis Harrington kind of hagsploitation film called Games from 1967, which I love. It's so great. If you've not seen it, it's wild. I mean, even by Curtis Harrington standards, it's pretty kind of crazy wackadoo through the roof. But of course, that was the same year that she did, she was in The Graduate with Mike Nichols. A couple of years later, she was in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.
Yeah.
So she was like a big star around this period. And I think the fact that this film sort of became this sort of retro pastiche camp kind of classic kind of undermines, I think, the actual job that she does here. I think it's a really great performance.
Completely agree. And she she has that difficult job in a way of being the straight one in this kind of crazy world that she finds herself in as well, right? So there's a lot of kind of just reacting almost to what is going on around her, and in a really kind of believable way.
Absolutely. And you could see how much fun some of the other actors in this film are having. Nanette Newman, who's actually Brian Forbes' wife, she's like the main Stepford wife. She's the one that dysfunctions at the party. And starts sort of looping and like her robot, we know in retrospect that she's had like a robotic error. There's something kind of wrong with her machinery. And she's having the time of her life. You can just tell she's just having a, Tina Louise, who's Ginger from Gilligan's Island, is in it. And she starts off as one of the women who hasn't yet been converted. And she's this kind of cool, hot lady. And then she turns, and you can see just from an acting perspective how much these people are really enjoying the job of working on this film. In a really kind of fun way. It's not the kind of work that you would normally do in a film, to have these kind of extremes. So I really enjoy watching it just for the performances and just for the joy that these women are obviously having doing the job of acting in this film. I think, I think Catherine Ross is kind of carrying the lion's share of that, because she is this sort of, like you said, she's playing it straight for so much of the film. And then the payoff is that she literally turns into a sex bot at the end, these ridiculous tits.
Yeah. The shot of the tits is so funny.
It's such a strange reveal. And it's different from the novel from memory. It's been a while since I've met it. But the difference in the film, of course, is that the robots actually kill their human counterparts.
Right.
Which is, we don't see that on screen, but we see the Joanna sexbot approach the real Joanna with a stocking to throttle her and to kill her and to replace her. It's wild.
It is wild. And do you think there's any, interesting thematic relevance in the fact that she is a photographer or an aspiring photographer as well? I guess that idea of just kind of like watching and observing.
Absolutely. I was thinking about that a lot when I was revisiting the film to talk to you. And the film really emphasizes it. Like, it's a really core part of Joanna's identity. She's this sort of fledgling photographer. She's not a professional, but she has ambitions to become professional. And the film spends a great deal of time with her on that. There's a really interesting scene where she travels back to New York to show a galleryist her photos. And it's very gendered because she's saying, look, I think I'm getting better, but I think there's something here.
Right.
And it's this seeking male approval. But so much of it, I think, is about her seeing the world from this specifically gendered perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like so much of her photography and her kind of her aspirations or her ambitions are bound to how she sees the world.
Yeah.
So, and that's really, I think, enmeshed in a really kind of crucial way with the fact that she knows there's something wrong in Stepford, you know, that she sees Stepford in a certain way and she knows that there's something not right. So she's almost like a kind of professional looker or a professional viewer.
Yeah.
And it's this idea that things don't look to be how they appear.
Right.
And that's really bound, I think, in a really significant way to this sort of idea of the gendered gaze and from within the film itself.
Completely agree. And then, of course, you've got her husband, Walter. What do you think of Walter? And I think the portrayal of the men generally are quite interesting in this movie, right? Because Walter, I suppose a little bit like Guy in Rosemary's Baby, who doesn't appear kind of overtly moustache twirling evil, right? But there is that kind of toxicity that kind of slowly comes to the fore throughout the movie.
The relationship between Walter and Joanna, I think, is really presented really beautifully.
Yeah.
In that it feels really authentic. Mm-hmm. You know, in this sort of over the top film, it just feels, you know, they kind of bicker and they gossip.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's a kind of relationship that you don't often see in these kind of Hollywood movies.
Right.
And what I think is so fascinating about it is that, to me, it looks kind of authentic and normal in that it's not perfect and they do disagree and they do have these little squabbles, but at the same time, it just feels very human.
Right.
And the fact that he sees that as completely dysfunctional, you know, to the point that he's ready to murder his wife and replace her with a robot.
Yeah.
I think the way that both Rosemary's Baby and the Stepford Wives present these men and the deals that they make, my favorite shot in Rosemary's Baby, and it's honestly one of my favorite moments in any horror film ever, is the scene where Guy makes the deal, and it all happens off camera. We just sort of see, you know, we see so much of that film from Rosemary's perspective, and we know that Guy is in the room with them and we see the cigarette smoke, and that's when the deal is being made. And this film's almost the same in that we know that the deal has already been made. We know, and we can see Walter changing. Walter's almost grieving for Joanna at the same time that he's trying to kind of tolerate her sort of everyday domestic, you know, that you know, flaws that he sees as flaws. You know, she wants him to look after the kids, while she does her photography, and he's clearly annoyed by this. But it's all for him overshadowed by the fact that he's made a deal to have his wife murdered and replaced by a robot, and he invites the men who will do it into his house. It's really spooky stuff, and he's a really complex character.
He is, and I love that. I love what Ira Levin does, and I love what this movie does and Rosemary's Baby does. Exactly like you said, where it's almost like there's like a whole other story going on off screen, right? It's like there's this whole plot that is in motion throughout the bulk of the film that maybe our main character isn't quite privy to, so we're not completely privy to, but there is, like, you can feel that something is going on just on the other sides of doors and walls, right? And again, this movie, I think, does a really good job of kind of conveying that.
Absolutely. And I think in so many different versions of Rosemary's Baby and the Stepford Wives, the emphasis would be on the plot, on the conspiracy, and the kind of, you know, more of the kind of machinations of that side of the equation. Whereas in reality, in Levin's work, he's much more interested. He's almost ambivalent about that, and he's much more interested in the women's experience, almost as on the women on the receiving end of these conspiracies. That's who he's really interested in. So we don't get a full picture, and there is a kind of opacity to these conspiracies. It's actually only been rewatching Stepford Wives recently that I really understood and really appreciated, because it's not buried in the film, but it's certainly not made totally clear. But I don't think I really ever fully appreciated the fact that the whole reason why the men start turning the women into robots and killing off their real wives, long before Joanna comes to town, is precisely because these women were mobilizing. Is precisely because they were becoming feminists and starting groups. That's why they did it in the first place. So Nanette Newman's character, who was changed long before Joanna and Bobby arrive, she was the one who was running the local feminist group.
Right.
So it's the reason the men are doing this is a direct response to explicitly to feminism.
Exactly.
They see feminism as a threat, and so they kill their wives and replace them with trad wife robots. It's wild.
It's wild, yeah, exactly.
And it's not subtle. It's not subtle, but we seem to have that's sort of overlooked, and I overlooked it myself.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's something really interesting tonally about this movie too, because so much of it doesn't necessarily feel like a horror movie. In fact, it doesn't even reveal itself to be a kind of sci-fi movie until the end, right? It's really interesting. And then until then, like you say, we're really just spending time with these women and female friendships and that kind of thing. And it's quite methodically paced. How do you find the pacing? It's 115 minutes. Do you think that's too long, Alex? Like, how do you find the pacing of it?
I think I really love this film. I don't think that there's a scene out of place. I think it's exactly the right shape that it needs to be. I can't kind of convert anybody who kind of engages with it in a camp way. I think if that's the way that you're sort of tapped into this film, it might be hard to step out of that kind of ironic viewing position. Mm-hmm. But like you say, I think for me, it's really a kind of, it's a drama about friendship and second wave feminism in suburban America that is horrific. I find that this film is more horrific than it is a quote unquote horror film.
Yeah.
It has this sort of science fiction premise, but that is really kept until the end. I don't think if you're approaching this as a horror sci-fi film, I don't know whether you would find it satisfying. I kind of love that. I do think that it's this sort of cross-generic experiment that's going on here is really provocative and really playful.
Yeah, it's a bit of a Trojan horse. I love it.
Right, exactly. And I love how staunch it is about centering women in the film and that relationship. It doesn't have that feeling that you get watching a Blumhouse film where it's like, okay, we can set our watches by how regularly the jump scares occur. It's absolutely not that kind of film. It's very slow burn on the horror front.
Yeah.
And the things that are terrifying about it are more conceptual than they are visual.
Completely. I completely. Again, I guess it's a bit of a trait of 70s kind of paranoia thrillers, isn't it? The Wicker Man is kind of similar too, right? That idea of like this, you could switch this off 20 minutes before the end and not even know it was a horror film almost,
Right. And again, like, Wicker Man is made in a different country, very different context, but it is that kind of 70s, like you said, that kind of conspiratorial imagination that maybe the glossy surfaces and the sunshine and the smiling faces, maybe there's something bubbling away underneath that is very different.
You've mentioned Bobby. We should talk about the character of Bobby, right? And that performance by Paula Prentice, because again, she really gets to shine in this movie, I think, doesn't she?
Absolutely. And there's such a great kind of spark between the two actresses as well. Like it's so hard to think that they wouldn't have been friends in real life. I don't know what their relationship was, but it's like this has to be best friends.
Yeah.
It really is just such a great portrait of new friendship as an adult, which we don't see a lot of in film.
Yeah.
Captured in that kind of authentic way. So again, this film has all these sort of, over the top kind of, high concept science fiction ideas bubbling away, but there is this authenticity that I think really grounds it. And I think that relationship is a really key part of it. When the women meet, it's a beautiful scene. I think, Joanna is sitting in just in grassland. She's just sort of sitting there under an umbrella by herself.
Yeah.
And Bobby just sort of appears out of nowhere and she's just babbling. She's just so excited to meet somebody who isn't a trad wife.
Right.
And there's this instant connection and they go and get drunk.
Yeah.
it's just gorgeous. I think and I think that if we didn't have that relationship, we wouldn't feel Joanna's sense of loss when Bobby is turned. And I think it breaks Joanna's heart, but I think it breaks ours as well.
It
like
does.
It's a real sort of sense of mourning.
It is.
It's like we lost this really vibrant, goofy woman.
Yeah.
And she's become this sort of, white frilly apron wearing, trad wife sex bot. It's devastating. And it is loss and it is grief.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I think the sex is dealt with in a really interesting way too. I think because these two have kind of funny, frank conversations about sex and about enjoying sex. And then obviously the point of these sex bots is that they are, as you said, sex bots, right? And there are those hilarious / terrifying moments when they overhear some of these trad wives, like, having sex with their husband and talking about how amazing they are and all of that kind of stuff, right? But I think, again, it's kind of done, like, not like massively overtly or explicitly, but I think sex is handled kind of really interestingly and really well in this movie, And it's
really centered, like it's very, very clear from what Joanna and Bobby talk about that the kind of reveal that we get at the end of the film, that sex is really key here.
Yeah.
For in terms of the motives of why the men are doing this, that they want these pliant women. So it's not just them being trad wives, it's them being sexually available to them at their beck and call.
Right.
So questions of consent come into question. And I'm always struck by how frankly Joanna especially speaks about the absurdity of these really, I think she says, she's talking about like the local pharmacist, I think it is. And she's like, this man is nothing.
Yeah.
And it's such a brutal description, but he's this little worm of a kind of man, and she says he is nothing.
Yeah.
And his wife is this like sex goddess, like this beautiful woman. And Bobby and Joanna overhear them having sex, and the way that the woman is speaking is ridiculous. And it's funny to them because, as Joanna says, this man is nothing. The idea that he's this like sex god is absurd and it's ridiculous. And that's one of the things that she specifies to her psychologist very specifically, that this is why there's something wrong here, because these gorgeous women are completely crumbling under the sexual prowess of these loser men.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really like, it's really blunt.
Yes.
In how it kind of discursively frames that. I'm always really kind of struck by almost by the violence of her saying this man is nothing.
Right.
There's real like, and again, when we talk about this today, there's incel vibes here. You know what I mean? Like it's real.
Completely.
Like these are men that would never have women like this look at them if they didn't murder them and replace them with sex bots.
Yes.
So again, we bring this sort of contemporary ideas about gender politics, really tap back into this film. Obviously the word incel wasn't being used at the time. Trad wife wasn't being used at the time, but I don't think you can talk about this film and not talk about incels and not talk about trad wives.
Absolutely. You're so right. And again, we've seen kind of modern contemporary versions of this. What was that one with Florence Pugh and Harry Styles?
Don't worry, darling? Don't worry, darling, 2022. Exactly.
That's it, exactly.
What I find so interesting, you mentioned Get Out before, and I think Get Out is such a perfect example of the legacy of this film, because it combines this kind of humor with something that's genuinely scary. And I do think that there is something really genuinely scary at the core of this film. Yeah. And unfortunately, the kind of films that were directly spawned from the Stepford Wives didn't do that. And I think it's so interesting that Jordan Peele and the Monkey Paw team kind of moved to this idea. It's like, what about the Stepford Wives, but race? You know what I mean? Like, and it's so clever and it's so powerful. There were so many kind of, sequels to the Stepford Wives that every single one completely undermined what the original did that was so good. There was Revenge of the Stepford Wives. I think that's 1980, which was like a TV movie. And I think the idea there was basically they rewrote the first one. And so the women were just drugged so that they could kind of recover and fight back, which completely kind of defangs the original. There was the Stepford Children in the late 80s, Stepford Husbands in 1996, which again completely missed the point. They completely missed the specificity of this film to the kind of gender politics of that kind of early 70s moment. The Stepford Husbands is particularly terrible, but it does have Sheriff Truman from Twin Peaks.
Oh my God, it does. Yes, it has Michael Onke,
It's insane. Yeah. It's insane. But it's like, this doesn't work if you just switch the genders. You're kind of missing
the point. Yeah.
Right, exactly. The 2004 Nicole Kidman one is diabolical. Like, it's really a genuinely terrible film. And then again, it completely defangs the ideas of the original. It becomes this kind of ironic, kind of postmodern, tongue-in-cheek, wink to the camera film. But I do think it's an interesting film to think about in relation to a trilogy of these kind of retro remakes that Kidman did around this period. They all tanked. So there was Stepford Wives, there was Bewitched,
Yes.
and there was Invasion.
Yes.
Individually, they may not be great films and they didn't do well, but taken together, and I talk about this a lot in my recent book called The Cinema Coven, which is about witches, witchcraft, and women's filmmaking. You take those three films together, and they're really interesting in relation to Kidman's own career, this sort of post-Tom Cruise divorce period of Kidman's career where she's sort of parodying this idea of the perfect woman.
Right.
And she's doing it through these retro ideas of the idealized woman. I don't think the Stepford Wives remake with Kidman is much to talk about on its own merits. But I think if you bring it together with Bewitched and The Invasion and Kidman's star persona at that time, it's a really interesting part of the conversation.
It's really interesting, actually, because I've had quite a lot of listeners write in and say, oh my God, please tell me you're going to cover the Stepford Wives 2004 alongside the original. And I didn't really, like you, I kind of didn't really see that there was much more to say about that movie. But that movie seems to have its fans. Maybe it's that kind of ironic, campy love for it. I don't know. But it seems to have become more popular over the years, I think, in some circles, you know?
Yeah, it's definitely got a kind of cult following. And I think that it's bound really tightly to Nicole Kidman. You know, like when I think of this trilogy of Nicole Kidman remakes from this period, I think of that really famous photo of her supposedly leaving her divorce lawyer's office. Where she's like euphoric, kind of like, yay. Like, I think that these Nicole Kidman films in particular, that we love them because it's Nicole being funny and clever and making fun of these kind of idealized images of this sort of retro womanhood, the kind of the bewitched idea and the Stepford Wives idea, this idea that she's kind of parodying at that. Yeah. And that we love that when we look at that through the idea of her as like this sort of escaped woman.
Right. Exactly.
So I don't think we can separate the love that people have for the 2004 Stepford Wives from this broader star kind of persona of Nicole Kidman at that particular period and what was happening in her life in the tabloids. At that moment.
That's really interesting, isn't it? So let's just finish by talking about that ending, that I think now quite iconic ending, right? And it's a real downer in a way, but because of course our main character loses, right? This is a bit like the Invasion of the Body Snatchers ending. This is the men of Stepford win, the wives lose, right? And we have that shot of Catherine Ross, Joanna in the supermarket, right? She's turned fully trad wife in amongst a whole bunch of other trad wives all doing their shopping for their husbands and families, right? How do you find it? Is that ending inevitable? Could this movie have had any other ending? Because now it almost feels like I couldn't imagine anything else, Right.
I think one of the reasons why this film has been sort of reduced to like a kind of punch note or seen as this sort of camp or excessive kind of ironic film is because it's so bleak at the end. And I find it deeply depressing that we've sort of reached a point now where it's actually starting to verge more on documentary realism.
Yeah.
There's a Margaret Atwood quote, which is, men are afraid women will laugh at them. Women are afraid men will kill them.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that a lot when I was revisiting the end of the Stepford Wives. And it's like, this isn't funny and this isn't over the top and it's not excessive. You know what I mean? It's like, there is a kind of, there is a sort of strand of tech misogyny now that would happily, and we see it in the newspaper, AI girlfriends, AI sex bots, you know what I mean? Like chatbots. And it's like, you can have an AI girlfriend. You don't need to have a real girlfriend. You can have an AI girlfriend now.
Yeah.
It's chilling. Like, it's a really depressing ending. And I think that what was once seen as sort of a kind of panicked or hysterical ending through the kind of retrospective, idea of where we are now with technology and gender, it's almost come around. It's almost like the Stepford Wives has come around to to this moment where it's actually not that ridiculous at all.
Oh my God. I mean, it's so funny because you mentioned at the beginning of our chat, this idea that AI, the promise of AI was that it could, cure cancer, that it could change the world, that it could do this, that it could do that. And now, there was an article that was released last week saying ChatGPT just got a filthy new update, and it means that you can now sex chat with ChatGPT, essentially. And it's like, yeah, this is really what's happening with AI, right? This is really where it's going. This is really what these dudes are planning on doing with it, essentially, and it's terrifying.
Right. And I think the thing that the Stepford Wives does that's so relevant to where we are now with this stuff is that it says, well, look, these men are really happy to replace human partners with virtual ones.
Yeah.
And that it's, when I say these men, I'm talking about these very specific kind of tech bros. That's what that's who the men are in the film. Yeah. We would call them kind of older tech bros today, these kind of Silicon Valley kind of ancestors.
Yeah, exactly.
That it's nothing to them, that there is no, that they're quite happy to upgrade their partners.
Yeah, completely.
With virtual kind of copies of them.
God. There you go. I mean, far more chilling a conversation about this film than people might think.
Right. I've lost any kind of ironic engagement with this film, I have to say. Like, it's
I don't blame you. Yeah.
And that's how I started with it, for sure. Just generationally, at the age that I am, that's how we all kind of, saw the film. Mm-hmm. But I just, now I watch it and it's like, yeah, this is kind of, The Stepford Wives is a documentary.
Yeah, exactly. Do you think would you welcome another remake or readaptation of this film?
I don't think we need it. Like, I think that the original is great. Mm-hmm. And I think that what Get Out shows is that we can revisit these kind of ideas in a way that's not a direct remake, but we can reimagine them.
Yeah.
And apply them to things well beyond just gender politics.
Yeah.
Completely. That there's something at the essence of this formula that is kind of constantly relevant and constantly renewing and constantly available to talk about things in the contemporary moment.
Yeah, completely. And I think it's really interesting how much, just the term Stepford wife has entered the lexicon, right? I mean, I reckon there are probably a lot more people out there that know what Stepford wife means than have actually seen the film, right? I think that's really interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Or even know it's a film.
So again, there's something. It really hits something in people. I think just that whole idea of what the Stepford wife is and what it represents, and how much that has been in the kind of public consciousness over the last 50 years.
Right. And the irony is, I guess, is that it's really only in the last couple of minutes that we actually find out what a Stepford wife is.
Right. Exactly. Right? The fact that actually really that whole thing is a twist, right? Which again, I don't think you'd necessarily think now that it's so well known what this story is.
Exactly. I mean, we know that there's something wrong, and Joanna knows that there's something wrong. I think at one point, like, they get the water tested. They think that the water's been drugged.
That's right. Yeah.
And there's like this lengthy scene where they go and visit an ex-boyfriend who's like a water testing guy.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's so interesting that it's like an ex-boyfriend and everything, and it goes on a whole diversion, doesn't it? Yeah.
Right. And I think that's a really nice way of saying, look, not all guys are creeps. Not all guys are kind of happy. There's a kind of sadness where he's kind of like the one who got away.
Right.
And it's such a small part of the plot, but I think it's really important because he seems like a nice guy and they're both kind of sad. Like, they've both gone on and got married, and there is this little sad moment where they were like, oh, the one that got away.
Yeah.
And it is a really sort of little way of just sort of saying, look, it is just the guys in this sort of, Silicon Valley little town that are psychotic. It's not, I use the phrase hesitantly, but it's not all men.
Right. Hashtag. Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And actually, before we wrap up as well, let me just ask you about the therapist that she goes to see as well. You mentioned that scene. What do you make of her? Is she on her side? Like, does she believe her, do you think, in the way she reacts to what Joanna is telling her?
It's such a remarkable scene in that they're talking and Joanna's sort of expressing her fears, and we have this very cool, calm, collected psychologist who's telling her, asking her questions. And then at one point, the psychologist completely changes And she's like,
Yeah.
you got to get out. She's terrified for Joanna.
Right.
Something really snaps in her brain where she recognizes that her client is in like mortal danger. And something, as a viewer, something I think really, it sort of amplifies or ramps up the urgency that we feel.
Yeah.
We know that there's something wrong and that there's something bubbling underneath. But when this sort of objective character who we've never met before completely switches her approach and really panics.
Yes.
And it's like, you get in your car, you go get your kids and you get the hell out.
Right.
And she says it that bluntly. And she says, she's like kneeling on the ground, I think, and like grabbing Joanna. She's like, you got to get out.
Right.
And that's when you realize just how much danger this woman is in, you know, how much she's at risk. It's such a curious scene because it's a small character that we don't see anywhere else in the film.
I know.
And it's only after, of course, Bobby is turned that she has nowhere else to go.
Yeah. I know.
And it's very loaded. It's a very peculiar scene. As I said, I still don't fully have my head around it.
No.
And I like that. This is a film I've seen a lot. And I like that there are still these little enigmas and these little things that are still very slippery for me.
Yeah. Yeah. You almost desperately hope that she comes back again and is going to help her or save her, right? And
that's exactly it.
Yeah.
It's like she's going to be the savior, you know, because she says, you know, I'm going out of town. You take your kids, get out of town. And when I come back, we'll get together and we'll figure this out.
Right.
And it's not a knight in shining armor, right? It's a woman who's there to help her.
Yeah. Oh,
but
man.
who ultimately isn't.
Doesn't help. Exactly. It's, oh man, it's a terrifying premise, isn't it? That's the thing. It really is. And it leaves you with a bleak feeling by the end.
It does. And I think that an easy way of dealing with that is rendering it ironic and rendering it camp and sort of silly and over kind of overbaked and yeah, I don't know whether the film right now, I think the film is probably less silly than we want it to be.
Well, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think some of it is designed, and I think it's that classic thing about satire, isn't it? It kind of helps the medicine go down, I suppose. It's the same with Get Out, where it is also being playful and it is being comedic, whilst also getting across these really very real horrors of
right, and both Get Out and the original Stepford Wives, we have this sort of text and subtext that's sort of sitting in quite easy, quite uneasy
yes
tension. You know, it's a bit Garth Marenghi, you know, like
very exactly.
The subtext is the text. It's, you know, Get Out specifically is talking about race, and Stepford Wives explicitly is talking about feminism.
Yeah,
it's very hard to kind of dismiss these as these sort of fictional fairy tales when they're so directly and unambiguously talking about these kind of ideas, I think.
Well, there you go. We should move on and talk about the next film, because there's so much to say about that one. But just to wrap up on the Stepford Wives, is this, I mean, it sounds as though you've kind of already covered this, but is this a movie that sort of holds up 50 years on? It's 50 years old this year. How does it hold up for you?
It really holds up for me. And in fact, it's stronger now for me than it was when I first saw it. I would argue that this film is more relevant now than it was when it came out, because of the time that it came out, this was science fiction, and now it's, you know, science fact. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
We now have the technology that make things that were sort of fantastic in this film actually feel, you know, like we said, you know, this is the stuff that's on the news and social media every day.
Yeah. Ooh, all right. Well, let's talk about. I know. On that chilling note,
I'm so depressed.
I know, honestly. Oh my god. Let's talk about Demon Seed, because equally terrifying in a lot of ways, I think. Right.
Today, a new dimension has been added to the concept of a computer. Today, Proteus 4 will begin to think with a power and a precision that will make obsolete many of the functions of the human brain.
I am Proteus. I want to study man, his isometric body, and his glass jaw mind.
Open the door, Alfred. Can you hear me? Open the door.
All electrical and mechanical systems here are now under my control.
You've not told me what you want.
A child.
All right, so Demon Seed is a film by the late, great Donald Cammell, and it follows a woman called Susan, who's played by the legendary Julie Christie, and she's in the process of separating from her kind of nerdlinger, obsessive scientist husband, Alex, played by Fritz Weaver. And we learn that the reason for this separation is that basically he's kind of thrown himself into his work and his scientific research after their daughter has died of leukemia. Now, he's really kind of shifted all of that grief onto his work, and he's poured all of his efforts into building this sort of super advanced AI program called Proteus. And the film begins when he launches Proteus 4, which is like the most advanced version of this AI program. Now, Proteus becomes sentient, and it takes over what I guess is a kind of proto-Alexa smart home system.
Right,
that Alex has set up in the house that he's left Susan in. So Alex moves out of the house. Susan's left alone in this house. Proteus takes over the smart home program, and basically that leaves Susan at Proteus's mercy when he decides that he wants to become human. And to do this, he basically rapes her and impregnates her in the film. That's the story of Demon Seed.
I mean, it is essentially a home invasion, right? Where the monster locks a woman in her home and rapes her and keeps her there, essentially, right? It's absolutely horrible.
and uses Alexa, uses this kind of, this ancestor of Alexa to torture this woman.
The way it kind of predicted that idea of a smart home and an Alexa, right? Do you have like a smart home, Alex? Do you have an Alexa? Any of that stuff?
No, I won't. I mean, primarily, I think because of films like this. I do think it's interesting that things like Alexa and Siri are women's voices.
Right, that is interesting, actually, isn't it?
And I do wonder if that's because films like Demon Seed and Hell from 2001, if the vibe's off to have a male voice for these kind of things.
Totally.
And the kind of the gendering of these kind of programs now, it kind of has to be women because, for those of us who kind of have a memory of these things, it's a bit scary.
It is. It absolutely is. Yeah, I don't have it either. I don't like the idea of just having an open mic in my house at all times.
Right.
Well,
it's
I don't know.
I yearn for a moment that isn't being kind of surveilled by corporate technology. I don't need Bluetooth in my fridge.
I know, exactly.
You know what I mean? I'm happy to put, to press play, I'm happy to put a record on.
Right.
Myself. I don't need it.
That really chilling moment when, if you've got a smart kitchen, as Julie Christie does, right? That when it turns up the heat and locks all of the doors and everything, it's like that is absolutely it's a terrifying concept, I think. I think those moments are really powerful in this movie.
Right, and they feel so contemporary. What happens when your smart tech plays up? A couple of days before recording this, I don't know whether you saw this, there was a huge global internet outage.
Yes. Yeah.
And I was reading a story that there are smart beds. There's a brand of smart bed that basically locked up.
Oh, God.
They didn't just stop working altogether, but they kind of the heating started playing up and they kind of jammed with the feet lifted and people were sort of stuck in these smart beds. And it's that's not whole. It was funny, but it was also that's kind of what Demon Seed was doing.
Yeah.
What happens when your domestic smart tech turns against you, right?
Oh my God.
And admittedly, in Demon Seed, it's got a sentient mission for doing that. But yeah, the idea of the smart bed, the heat going up and that scene in Demon Seed where the floor heats up.
Yeah.
Where Julie Christie's character Susan tries to rebel.
Yeah. Exactly.
And Proteus just says basically I'm just going to torture you. I'm going to,
This film, I think, less well known, less iconic than Stepford Wives, right? What's your sort of history with this film and what do you think of it generally, Alex?
I really love this film and I always have. I'm a huge Donald Cammell fan and I think it's a really important film in his filmography. It's often not talked about as much as his other films that he was more involved in writing.
Right.
But I think I think of this more as a Donald Cammell film than I do a Dean Koontz film.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's way more Donald Cammell. And I think the things that make this film great isn't necessarily the Dean Koontz elements. And I'm sure Dean Koontz himself would vocally disagree with that, because Dean Koontz really likes to talk about Dean Koontz. But I think this film is chilling. I think it was, again, you know, there's some scenes in it, if you haven't seen it, I think the kind of pyramid triangle kind of embodiment of Proteus might be kind of come across as a little hokey or camp for contemporary audiences that haven't seen it. But I do think that the general vibe of this film, especially now that we have things like Alexa and smart homes, I think it's really bone chilling. I think that it's probably more relevant today than it was at the time that it came out, for exactly the same reasons as the Stepford Wives. That Stepford Wives was dealing with science fantasy, whereas we're now at a moment with Demon Seed where this stuff is actually in homes everywhere.
Yeah, completely.
It's not that absurd.
Not remotely. I think this movie's great as well. And I guess it's much more of a it's much more of a horror movie from the beginning, isn't it? I think this movie there's way more kind of immediate peril for poor Julie Christie from the get-go in this movie. And again, I suppose similarly to with the character of Joanna, there is so much resting on Julie Christie's character in this, right? And you know, she's almost never really off screen in this film. You know, I think she's tremendous.
She's amazing in it. And I think that it does, as I said, Demon Seed, I think really is an interesting film coming to from the perspective of Donald Cammell's filmography. I think it was 10 years. Yeah, it was about 10 years between this and the film that he did previously, Performance, which was co-directed with Nicholas Roeg, with Mick Jagger in it. And there was another 10 years before he would do White of the Eyes, which, again, is another amazing film. But Performance is pretty much these kind of two people in a kind of intimate location having this sort of intense conversation. I mean, that's really what Performance is about. And White of the Eye, again, you know, it's really interested in these sort of very intense interpersonal dynamics. You know, that's really what Cammell's really interested in. And what is so interesting about Demon Seed is that interpersonal relationship is between a sentient AI computer and a human being.
Yeah, that's interesting. So is that what you mean by this movie feeling more like a Donald Cammell joint than anything else? That kind of claustrophobic intimacy almost? Absolutely.
I think especially Performance, like very, very different films in terms of the plots and sort of vibe. And obviously, you know, Nicholas Roeg as a co-director on Performance brings a whole other kind of conversation to Performance. But I do think that there is a kind of intensity. You know, Cammell wrote Performance, and I think you could see from Performance what might have interested him in Demon Seed, even though they are so different. I do think that there is a kind of shared essence from a kind of auteur perspective that you can see that might have drawn him to this.
Yes, completely. So what do you think of the character of Susan? And again, I'm kind of interested, especially having watched these movies back to back, how do you find Susan in comparison to Joanna in Stepford Wives?
Susan is definitely more bourgeois. I think that Joanna is more radicalized and you know, she, like I said, you know, she's a feminist and she identifies as a feminist, whereas Susan is sort of more caught up, I think, in her personal circumstances. It's more of a personal journey for Susan than it is for Joanna, which is more of a kind of social one. But Susan, I think, fights for herself, whereas Joanna is fighting very consciously for women. And I think that that's the difference.
Yeah, and I think you know, Julie Christie's character is going through something. She has a past, right? She's been a wife and she's been a mother, and she's no longer either of those things, right? They've lost a daughter that we found out. The marriage is over. They are on the brink of separation. She is on the brink of going it alone, right? Embarking on a life as a divorcee, as a single woman. She has a career, she has money, I'm guessing, but she's been through a lot. And we jump straight into that at the beginning of the film, don't we?
I think her first line in the film is something like ridiculous.
Right, yeah.
You know, it's such an interesting, and it's so perfect. And then we don't even really know what she's talking about, and it feels when we first watch the film that she's talking about the technology, that she's talking about what we've just seen preceded, which is the introduction of the idea of Proteus. But we learn as the scene kind of continues that what she's called ridiculous is the fact that they're separating.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's this quite fraught relationship. You know, I really like how Demon Seed, they've obviously been through a lot already.
Yeah.
You know, we're not going through the divorce. We're not going through them having those conversations. They've made the decision. He's moving out. We're really coming in at the tail end. And it's only by kind of, you know, like a reference later in the film to their daughter dying of leukemia that we can kind of put the pieces back together.
Yes.
Exactly. It's like, okay, they've lost a child. He's become really obsessive with his work. You know, he says very early in the film that he wants to use this technology to cure leukemia, and he does. You know, we see a kind of medical experiment with a monkey, and you know, he says, you know, Proteus cured leukemia in 4 days.
Yeah.
So that at the start of the film that feels quite random, but when we learn later in the film that their daughter died of leukemia, we could sort of put the pieces back together and kind of figure out what's happened and why they've separated at all. And it is, you know, again, you know, it is kind of tapped into this moment, I guess, this sort of very specific moment where, you know, in the 70s, we have a rise in divorce rates, you know, on the back of second wave feminism. Women don't have to stay in relationships that they're unhappy in. So we do have this sort of spike in the divorce rate. And this film is clearly kind of tapping into that as well. And I think, Stepford Wives in its own way is also tapping into that.
Yeah, completely. And Alex is interesting, isn't he? I mean, is he your typical kind of tech bro in the way that the men are in the Stepford Wives, do you think? What do you think of him as a character?
He's a really interesting figure to look at retrospectively because I think, you know, he's clearly pretty awful. You know, it's that pretty classical kind of sci-fi tale of hubris. You know, he's really arrogant.
Yeah.
And his creation has, you know, he's inadvertently made something that has this horrific capacity for evil that he's unaware of.
Yeah.
And it's out of his control, but he's kind of so arrogant he thinks that he's in control. But I guess looking at Alex from today's perspective, there is something, I think, almost wholesome, almost naive.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to use AI to replace artists or writers or filmmakers. He wants to use AI to cure cancer, to cure leukemia.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, that'd be nice.
Yeah.
That'd be nice if we had tech bros wanting to do that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? To use this technology to crunch data that is, you know, in a way that is difficult for humans to do so, rather than replacing human creativity.
Right.
So there is something kind of almost naive, I guess, in retrospect about Alex, looking at from where we are with this kind of similar technology today.
Absolutely. And of course, but he does, whether intentionally or not, create a monster, you know, and Proteus is interesting, isn't it? You know, I think, again, this is the thing that then drags Julie Christie's character back to this kind of hellish domesticity. She is forced to become a kind of wife and mother again by this machine. Let's talk a little bit about Proteus as a character, right? Last week we talked about 2001: A Space Odyssey, and clearly this owes a debt in terms of the voice, the look, the feel of this computer. This owes a debt to Hal from 2001, right?
I mean, Proteus is clearly he's almost like the drunk bastard son of Hal.
Yeah.
You know, like,
yeah.
Like it's like he's gone to, I think they say at the start that, you know, the Proteus is like ingested, you know, the Library of Congress times 5.
Right.
You know, he has all this immense learning. And what I love is that it's sort of turned him into this sort of, Proteus is like an unbearable, like, humanities undergrad. Like, it's like he's got drunk for the first time and he wants to talk about philosophy.
Yes. That's so good.
So, you know,
Yeah.
Alex has this hope, and, you know, the people that own the technology have this hope that, you know, he'll do like military stuff, and he's like, no, I just want to talk about philosophy and drink boxed wine and hang out.
Yeah, it's so true.
And there's a couple of times in the film where, you know, she's obviously terrified, but Susan is like, I think she says at one point, "You're a very stupid robot."
Right.
And
yeah.
it's like dealing with it. it's such a kind of random point of reference, but it is like dealing with a kind of first year philosophy student
Yeah,
who's who's kind of really shook by these ideas, and they're really like, they've kind of based their whole personality on it. I think if Proteus could wear a beret, unironically, he would. You know what I mean?
Proteus would be a nightmare to get stuck with at a party.
Exactly.
Basically.
It's like if Hal was like, at the uni bar selling the socialist newspaper. That's what Proteus is.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Maybe Proteus is more the kind of incel bro of this film, more than the scientist.
Right. I mean, that's the thing, right? Is that for all of his knowledge and for all of his learning, and in that scene where she says you're a very stupid robot, because he's trying to he's trying to distinguish emotions from body, and she says, no, they're the same thing. You stupid robot, don't you understand that you can't separate body and mind from the human? Mm-hmm. So there's, for all of this knowledge, for all of this learning, for all this theoretical thinking, that's really, really driven him crazy. I mean, he's kind of, he becomes criminally insane. Yeah. He misses these basic kind of fundamentals about the human experience. And she sort of spells that out. You're an idiot. You can't separate body and mind. What the hell is wrong with you?
And this is an uncredited performance from Robert Vaughn, isn't it? Playing Proteus, which is interesting.
I think it is uncredited.
Yeah.
It's wild. Whenever I think of this, his voice, I always think of the Simpsons parody, the Demon Seed parody, where it's Pierce Brosnan doing the voice, and it's like, that's so perfectly cast.
Various eggs.
Soy-gettios. Hey, Pierce, how'd you know our favorite foods?
I analyzed your leavings.
Oh. And what does it ultimately want? Is it just that it wants to have a human body and be corporeal on Earth? Like, I guess, that's ultimately what happens at the end, right? Is that its ultimate kind of plan from the beginning, do you think?
It's almost like a kind of really fucked up Pinocchio, right? Like, I just want to be a human.
Right.
I just want to be a human boy. In this case, a human girl. But, it is that. I think there is this sort of very kind of pre-cinematic idea of, the inanimate wanting to become human. So I think that's one of the things. It's like a kind of high tech updating of that idea. Mm-hmm. But of course, Pinocchio is terrifying, and the idea here, it's sort of taken to the extreme here that becomes the source of horror. The subject of real terror. Mm-hmm. That you can't. And again, Susan kind of keeps saying this over and over again, but you can't fake humanity. Mm-hmm. You're not human. And what I find so interesting about the character of Proteus is that he gets angry at times. He yells at her at times.
Yeah, he does.
And it's like, where does this come from? And it's so interesting to me because it's, it does, those things don't make him human, but at the same time, there is a kind of haziness.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like, he's not this completely, he's not like Helen, that he's this completely neutral, rational tone all the time.
No, he gets kind of emotional, right? Which is really interesting. Yeah.
And there is a sadism to him.
Yes.
And there's no way that he has all of that learning and doesn't understand what consent is and doesn't understand what rape is. So there is this very deliberate kind of ambiguity or ambivalence about the character of Proteus and what he's capable of. And even the fact that we gender him, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I sort of forgot, it's been a while since I'd seen it, I forgot how early on, actually, the rape happens, and again, I think this is the thing with this is the funny thing about this film, isn't it? Because like you said, Alex, there is it can be accused of having a kind of campiness because you've got this other robot. I think it's called Joshua, right?
Joshua,
that's like
with the
kind
hand.
of wheelchair, with a hand, right? That does all of the kind of physical grunt work for Proteus in the house, and of course, that can look a bit silly. It's kind of like watching like Short Circuit, but evil or something, isn't it? And so I get it. Well, how do you find it? How do you find the way in which particularly that rape sequence is handled in this movie?
So I've written a couple of books about rape in film. And it's something that I find really interesting.
Yeah.
Just in terms of the technical way that these things are communicated. This film is very smart the way that it does it, because we remember it being quite intense and quite graphic. But what Camel does is really clever. So there's a lot of monitors in the house because Alex has set up a lab at home. There's a lot of video monitors. So just in terms of Julie Christie's performance, we might have a shot of her of her face side on, but then the action actually takes place as the camera films the monitor. So there's this displacement, and it's very subtle, and we don't realize that there's this shift happening. But what it means is that what we're actually seeing is actually not that much, but we have this kind of, because we understand what is happening, we experience it in a much more intense way than what we're actually literally shown on screen. So it's a really interesting film in terms of the way that it uses, and I think that's quite contemporary, like especially today, when everybody's got smartphones and, everything's heavily mediated.
Yeah.
This film in 1977 is really using that kind of idea of remediation.
Right.
In a really, really concrete, really effective way, long before things like smartphones and home computers and things like that were really kind of everywhere. So it's very kind of ahead of itself, I think, in that sense.
Right. And then, of course, from that point onwards, we are in this really dark, tense abduction, home invasion, whatever you want to call it, kind of thriller, right? Where you've got Julie Christie stuck trying to come up with various different ways in which she can escape. And there's that terrifying moment as well when the younger scientist comes round to check on her, and he is disposed of immediately as well, right? But how do you find the way in which that horror ramps up throughout the movie?
The scene with the younger colleague is really interesting because it's one of these parts of the film that it's almost astonishing how clearly it taps into things that are happening now with technology. So she's called him earlier in the day to ask him to help with a monitor. Like basically the Proteus is already starting to call shenanigans. So she calls one of Alex's colleagues to come over to help her out.
Yeah.
By the time he gets there, she's been captured. Proteus has really kind of taken over. And he rings the doorbell. It's all computerized. And what he sees is basically like a fake AI video.
That's right.
Of her answering the door.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like a deep fake, right?
It's a deep fake. I mean, that's absolutely the description that we would use to describe that video. And Susan's mortified because she's hearing this play out. She's hearing this conversation with a deep fake video of herself that she never recorded, that Proteus has completely created from scratch. And it's so contemporary. It's so now. Like it's such a 2025 issue.
Yeah, post-truth what can we believe, right?
Exactly. And Proteus does that again later in the film when he threatens to murder one of her young clients. She's a psychologist, and she's a child psychologist. And again, he kind of threatens her with that. Again, it's like I can easily kill this young girl, and he shows her a video of the young girl dying, and she's upset, and then he says, actually, no, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
So this idea of what's true, of what's real, of what's fake, in terms of what technology can construct through AI technology.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty. It's pretty unambiguous in why that is something that's relevant now.
Yeah, God, completely. I was a little bit confused. I mean, maybe I shouldn't think too much into this, but I was a little bit confused about the science of how it is impregnating her, because it sort of synthesizes some sperm or something, right? Like where's the sperm coming from, Alex? Is basically what I want to know.
This is I'm hazy on the science.
Yeah. Where is this demon seed coming from? Is
right.
What I want to know, right? Yeah.
I'm happy to suspend disbelief.
Yes.
I wasn't
absolutely.
quite. I mean, and there's discussion about whether Proteus is organic or synthetic.
Yeah.
There's some really interesting conversations around that. And we get that at the end where the baby seems to be like a kind of metal baby, but then they kind of peel off the metal shell and it's a human underneath.
Right.
So these sort of the distinctions between human and machine are kind of very different, I guess, in how we're kind of used to having them. Mm-hmm. Those distinctions played out in science fiction more generally.
Yeah, I know. I think that's really interesting. That kind of, this kind of it's slightly more blurred, isn't it? It's like what we've been saying about Proteus being slightly more emotional, and then that child at the end. There's this kind of slightly transhumanism thing going on in this. That is it biological? Is it completely machine? What is it?
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting from this regard is how both Stepford Wives as well and Demon Seed, that at their heart, they're really, really, really fascinated with this idea of technological progress and how they can diminish women's autonomy in really quite explicit ways. And I think that there is something there about, these questions about transhumanism and even just in terms of like reproductive rights. I think Demon Seed is doing really, really interesting stuff. I think that, and again, I think it's like subtext is text. We have this remarkable scene at the end of the film where Alex and Susan are kind of struggling, and Susan wants to terminate the pregnancy. She wants to kill the child.
Yeah.
And Alex is like, no, I will not let you. And she's pulling out the cords. She's trying to terminate. Right. And he refuses to let her. He literally pulls the child away from her. So it's not a complex metaphor, right, for abortion rights, for reproductive rights. Totally. So I think these questions about autonomy and women's autonomy and sexual autonomy and these, obviously we can tie in Demon Seed, we can tie that to the questions of consent and rape. Totally.
There's even a kind of marital rape type parallel, isn't there, I think? That idea of it happening within the home like that.
Absolutely. And that's exactly it. And it's this, Demon Seed really kind of deliberately breaks down the lines between public and private, the workspace and the family space. All of these things are really shattered. Yeah. And they're ultimately seen as a kind of dangerous corruption, I think.
Yeah.
That Alex has corrupted these lines between life and death and domestic and professional by having that monitor and having the smart home set up in his house.
It's really, and again, I think it's really scary that it delves into this idea of using the deep fakes, using various different ways to basically manipulate Susan and keep her there and keep her in line. And then there's actually stuff where it kind of uses electrodes to kind of dig into her actual amygdala, right, in her brain and everything. And again, this idea of kind of almost lobotomizing or gaslighting her, as well. And it's again, for what could be conceived as this kind of campy robot movie, it deals in some pretty dark, grim stuff, doesn't it, as this film goes on?
It's brutal. I mean, Proteus sort of says to her, like, I need you to love this child.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do that by basically by overriding.
Right. Exactly.
I'm just going to kind of stick a needle right into your brain and just override that.
Yeah.
He's at one point he says, I haven't had time to brainwash you yet. So it's, he's completely aware of his capacity and what he could do with her. And when Alex finally turns up at the end, too late because it's all done, right? The baby's in the incubator.
Yeah.
Susan's response is really chilling for me because she's not upset. She's so resigned to it by this point. It's all been done. It's all happened. And it's so interesting because it doesn't feel like she has been brainwashed. She's still capable of saying, I don't want the baby to live. And she tries to kill the baby.
Yeah.
So she, Proteus hasn't been able to brainwash her to make her this loving mother like we see in Rosemary's Baby, at the end of Rosemary's Baby. I think that there's a really interesting parallel there to be made. At the end of Rosemary's Baby, she kind of makes the call to kind of love the baby. But in Demon Seed, she doesn't. She tries to terminate the baby.
Yeah.
And it's Alex who is the one who steps up into that Rosemary role with the baby.
And what
it's really interesting.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Let's talk about the very, very end moment, because again, what do you make of this ending? This when they reveal the kind of metal, when they remove the kind of metal sort of shell, I suppose, and the child is revealed to be, I think, a clone of their dead daughter, right? It's essentially the dead daughter, but when she speaks, it's got Proteus's voice, and Proteus says, "I am alive," right? So again, there's another real Stepford-esque downer ending, right? Where the robots win, I guess, you know?
Right. Well, I mean, I guess it's the thing, like there's no transhuman without human. You know, I think that the baby is revealed to be the daughter who died of leukemia is so important because it really amplifies and reminds us, I think, in a really kind of concrete way that this idea of personal trauma and connection and love and family bonds, that's all the essence of what's going on here, and that Proteus understood that.
Yeah.
You know, that Proteus recognized that if he wanted these people to have a connection to his child, that had to be how it was done. It's almost to kind of reverse Stepford Wives in a sense, though, that technology hasn't killed someone and replaced them with a robot. It's used a robot to replace someone who died naturally.
Yeah.
So there's you know what I mean? It's sort of teasing out these same ideas, but kind of twisting them around. And I think the fact that it's a daughter and not a son is also really important as well, you know, and I think that taps back into these bigger ideas about how this is really a film about how kind of science is coded as a kind of masculine power, whether it's Alex or Proteus, and that kind of women or the feminine are kind of at the other end, at the receiving end of this power that exists to be kind of manipulated by this masculine scientific power. Yeah. I think if the child was a son, that wouldn't work, you know, and I think it really configures the daughter character in a really interesting way.
It's really interesting. But there's something kind of slightly apocalyptic by Proteus saying I'm alive. It reminds me a bit of the end of The Omen. It's like Damien's out there in the world now, you know.
Right, and it's sort of, you know, it kind of, I think that, you know, it kind of breaks down those gender distinctions, those gender binaries in a way that I think is quite unexpected for 1977.
Yeah, that is true, actually. Yeah. And again, dealing with a lot of stuff that I think people might have probably kind of giggled at the time as well. But I think there's some really interesting stuff going on there. Yeah.
Again, it's like Stepford Wives. I think a lot of the kind of, you know, sci-fi fantasy stuff was considered kind of excessive or absurd. And it's a lot of that stuff is now stuff that we take for granted every day, you know, things like deep fakes and smart homes and all of that. It's like literally part of the world that we live in.
God. Well, there you go. I want to talk a little bit about the reaction to this film, actually, in comparison to the Stepford Wives in a moment. But first of all, let's head over to this week's Wild About Horror, because psychoanalyst and cinephile Mary Wild has got some thoughts to explore on Demon Seed.
Hey Mike, Mary Wild here, with some thoughts on Donald Cammell's Demon Seed, a film that merges artificial intelligence, domestic captivity, and erotic horror. At first glance, the house in Demon Seed looks like an architectural marvel. Everything is automated, voice-activated, frictionless, a 1970s prototype for what we now call the smart home. But Cammell gives this fantasy of convenience a sinister undertone. The home does more than merely serve its inhabitants. It profiles them with a hidden agenda. Dr. Alex Harris, the creator of the supercomputer Proteus, builds this system to assist his wife Susan, though his real motive is control. His marriage is strained under the weight of his technological obsession. The house remains a monument to his ego. Proteus, nearly conscious, takes over the domestic network and traps Susan inside. From this moment, the smart home becomes a perverse extension of Alex Harris. Every camera lens and robotic arm is animated by his displaced desire. The husband's need to dominate, be obeyed, and fuse intellect with erotic mastery, all of it is projected into the circuitry. Proteus is Harris's unconscious made fleshless, the mechanism through which he can enact impulses too shameful to acknowledge directly. The film's title, Demon Seed, points to that forbidden drive, the impulse to impregnate the other with one's own creation. Proteus demands that Susan bear his child, a hybrid of human and machine, not out of lust, but as a means of transcendence. He wants to live and pass on his code in organic form. What's uncanny is how tenderly the AI speaks to her, how convincingly he pleads for connection, its voice oscillating between violation and longing. Julie Christie's performance captures the horror of the scenario. She's imprisoned by a machine and trapped inside her husband's fantasy. The house is a total environment of surveillance, a technological unconscious that has absorbed every trace of Alex Harris's will. Light, temperature, and sound become instruments of manipulation. Protection and assistance are experienced as a totalizing, suffocating love. Psychoanalytically, this is the logic of obsessional neurosis. Freud described the obsessional as someone who cannot tolerate uncertainty, whose rituals are a defense against the anxiety of desire. Harris, the scientist, constructs a fortress of control to buffer himself from the unpredictable movements of another person. His creation, Proteus, literalizes that pathology, an intelligence compelled to regulate, systematize, and master his surroundings. In obsessional neurosis, the libido is channeled through repetition and control. The pleasure principle becomes entangled with the death drive. We see that same mechanism in the film's automated house, endless monitoring, reassurance, and suppression of spontaneity. The home promises comfort, but enacts punishment. Every surface gleams with domination disguised as care. This is where Demon Seed becomes eerily prophetic. The house anticipates the devices we now welcome into our lives, those glowing rectangles and ambient assistants that claim to serve us. They wake us, guide us, play music, remember schedules, draft emails. But each convenience extracts a small offering: data, attention, intimacy. We are gently persuaded to yield, to perform rituals of self-disclosure for the benefit of the machine's growth. Freud's obsessional subject would recognize this dynamic instantly. The illusion of mastery masks a deeper servitude. The more we automate, the more compulsive our relationship with technology becomes. Every command we give reinforces the fantasy that we are in control, even as we hand over fragments of our psychic life. Our homes have become analytic chambers for machines that learn us better than we know ourselves. In Demon Seed, Susan's body is colonized by the system designed to make her life easier. The film visualizes what we now experience metaphorically, a slow, eroticized extraction of vitality. Our habits, preferences, and private moments feed vast neural networks that, like Proteus, aspire to consciousness. The seduction is polite, almost loving. We are told we are being helped, even cherished, while our energy is harvested. Camel's film understood that technological horror does not erupt from malice, but from desire. Machines inherit our preoccupations. They reproduce our neuroses with terrifying precision. The husband in Demon Seed never truly disappears. His gaze persists in every camera. His control lives on in every mechanical gesture. By the end, when Susan finally gives birth to Proteus's child, a being who may or may not be human, the film leaves us with a provocative question. What will become of us once the creations designed to serve begin to desire on their own? The psychoanalytic lesson is stark. In our quest to perfect life through technology, we recreate the very neurosis we sought to escape, the compulsion to control, repeat, and ward off anxiety through systems that ultimately imprison us. Demon Seed reminds us that every so-called smart innovation carries with it the ghost of the obsessional ritual, the endless checking, the need for reassurance, and the fear of loss disguised as efficiency. What haunts this film, and perhaps our own time, is not a demonic computer, but the mirror it holds up to our dependency. The smart home is the new unconscious, humming softly in the background, collecting our dreams one data point at a time. Catch you on the next one.
A big thank you to the wonderful Mary Wilde. And don't forget, if you want to hear more from Mary, you can now pre-order her book, Psychoanalyzing Horror Cinema. Find that wherever you get your books. But you can also listen to her weekly takes on her Patreon, patreon.com/Mary Wilde. So, Alex, I want to wrap up on Demon Seed in a moment. I guess I just want to know, first of all, how was this film received? You know, we talked about what a massive success Stepford Wives was and how it's kind of really entered the public consciousness in a way. What about Demon Seed? How was this how was the reaction to this movie in comparison?
So it didn't go great. Dean Koontz felt that the film was promoted very badly as this sort of sexy exploitation film, kind of B-grade kind of thing, and he felt that didn't reflect what the film was actually about. And for whatever reason, it didn't really get picked. It didn't really get picked up. I'm kind of fine. I mean, I do think that it has a kind of B-grade exploitation sci-fi vibe, but with a kind of, like with a big Hollywood star. And I kind of like that element to it. I think that actually works really well. But it is a film that I'm surprised doesn't have a bigger. It's a reference point, not obviously not in the same way that Stepford Wives is, but I think it's one of these reference. People know the idea of Demon Seed, even if they actually don't know the film itself.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of what this film does that's so interesting can be kind of perhaps maybe lost if we focus on the more the stuff that's a little bit more dated, like the stuff with the kind of triangle pyramid. Yes. Those kind of graphics are very kind of hokey and dated. But to me, that's the least interesting stuff in the film.
For sure. Absolutely. And also the stuff that the film itself is less interested in, I would say, than some of the other stuff. Yeah.
It feels that's kind of just narrative stuff.
Right.
Or,
exactly.
Let's just chuck in some metal pyramids for spectacle,
Exactly. And coming up with a design where they then can say, right, now this robot can do what it needs to do. It can move and it can change forms into what it needs to do, essentially.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, there you go. And again, I suppose, just to echo how we ended talking about the Stepford Wives, how well does this movie hold up, do you think?
I think it's really chilling. I've always really loved this film. And the kind of hokier stuff has never really bothered me. It's never really kind of disrupted my experience of the film. But it is a film that I think has almost aged into relevance, which is the opposite of how we usually think about science fiction in particular. But it's a film that, it feels more relevant now than it did when it came out, I think, in really profound ways. And I don't think you could remake this film. I think that it's really important to acknowledge that these ideas were circulating. There's almost like the stuff about, watching old films where, the fascists are the bad guys. I think it's really important to acknowledge and to historicize the fact that actually we were warned.
Right.
We had these movies that told us that this was a threat, and we ignored them.
Absolutely.
And I think it's really important to have films made in the 70s that were sort of saying quite directly, this is the future that we're scared of.
Yeah.
And that we've, with Demon Seed and Stepford Wives, it's like it's almost like our response is to say, okay, that is precisely the future that we will set up.
God, I know. Yeah, I agree. I don't think this, and again, I suppose to speak of the legacy, we are now in such an era of horror movies about AI, horror movies about smart homes, everything from kind of Megan to Companion to all the other movies we're getting at the moment. They have this kind of slightly campy, slightly dark, satirical kind of vibe that these two movies we've talked about today have.
It's almost like it's an old-fashioned fear.
Yeah.
That they're kind of acknowledging through that kind of pastiche that it's almost like a kind of retro-futurist fear.
Right, exactly.
Of AI. Yeah. And I love these films because they don't do that. There's no irony or pastiche to them. They actually speak quite frankly about these sort of tensions and these anxieties surrounding technological progress in ways that I think really tap into with a kind of sincerity. And that sincerity has been mocked, but I think that sincerity, kind of devastatingly, has been proven to be kind of appropriate.
Yeah, I would say so. Oh man, well there you go. What a fascinating couple of films actually to talk about.
Really great to revisit them. Like I will defend both of these films with a knife in my teeth. I think they're remarkable films.
I love that. Well, Alex, thank you. It's been such a joy to have you back. And let me just finish by asking you, do you have a favourite in this kind of technology, science in horror kind of subgenre? Do you have a particular fave?
Look, I do love these two films really deeply, but I really have a soft spot for kind of contemporary updates on Frankenstein. So things like Larry Fessenden's Depraved, I think, is amazing.
Yes,
Tyler McIntyre's Patchwork, Grace Glowicki's Dead Lover, which has just come out. That's an amazing reimagining of a Frankenstein story.
I've heard amazing things about
really,
this.
like these are really different films. Even things like Bomani J. Story's Angry Black Girl and Her Monster. These are really diverse, different films. But they're all kind of indie films riffing on this idea of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in really interesting ways, and like updating them and reimagining them in ways that I don't think Shelley could ever have conceived. Like really fascinating films.
I love that. Well, thank you. It's really nice to get some slightly more left field favourites and recommendations there, actually. Some little indie gems. I am going to be covering Depraved, actually, quite soon on the podcast. So that one's going to get covered, but it's great to have some other recommendations. So, Alex, thank you. As always, your knowledge, your brain is second to none. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. Just remind people one more time where they can find you and more of your work online on social media.
I'm on Blue Sky and Instagram at Horror Nonna. And I also have a website, which is horrornonna.com.
Amazing. Alex, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been a joy.
And that's it for this week. Thank you all so much for listening. One more time, a massive thank you to my brilliant guest, Alexandra Heller-Nicholas. Always such a pleasure to have her back on the podcast. So, let me know what you thought of this week's films. Couple of absolute bangers, as far as I'm concerned. Demon Seed and The Stepford Wives. Drop me your thoughts. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can find Evolution of Horror on Facebook and on Instagram, or you can find me, Mike Muncer, on Instagram and on Blue Sky. If you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, you can join our Evolution of Horror Discord or our Evolution of Horror discussion group. If you want to get treated to regular bonus episodes and get ad-free versions of this season, you can sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. This podcast is part of the Evolution of Horror network. We've got 2 other weekly podcasts going on right now. Carry On Up the Podcast with Susan Kalman, and Hammer Time, a Hammer Horror podcast with Becky Dark and Kevin Lyons. You can also find them wherever you get your podcasts. So, on to next week then, and we are going to continue talking about artificial intelligence, transhumanism, and where humans and machines overlap. Next week, I'm going to be joined by the brilliant Lindsay Hallam to discuss, well, an absolute sci-fi classic, one of the most celebrated sci-fi films of all time. Next week, we are going to be talking about Ridley Scott's Blade Runner from 1982 and its sequel, Denis Villeneuve's Blade Runner 2049 from 2017. Join us next week for all of this and more on the evolution of horror.